Okay, so we're continuing again. We're talking about Sfiras Omer and Shavuos. So I want to mention yet another thought from the Meshech Chochmah, and that is, we know that the Torah says you start counting the Omer mimacharas HaShabbos, from the day after Shabbos. Now we know that there was a huge machlokas that went on for hundreds of years between the Tzedukim, the followers of a man called Tzadok who did not believe in the Torah Shebaal Peh, versus the Prushim, called the Pharisees, that's our Chazal. And what does it mean, Mimacharas HaShabbos? The Tzedukim took the pasuk very, very literally. Shabbos means Saturday. Mimacharas HaShabbos means Sunday. And therefore, one starts counting the Omer the Sunday after the first day of Pesach. The first Sunday after the first day of Pesach, you start counting the Omer because it has to be Mimacharas HaShabbos. This was the position of the Tzedukim. The Prushim, our Chazal, our Torah Shebaal Peh, however, says that Shabbos does not mean Saturday in that pasuk. Shabbos means the first day of Pesach, Yom Tov. Yom Tov is also called Shabbos, because although you're allowed to do certain malachos, there is a shvisa, there is a cessation of work, and therefore Mimacharas HaShabbos is the second day of Pesach, not the first Sunday after the first day of Pesach, but the second day of Pesach. Now, this was a machlokes that went on quite a long time, and the Chachamim went to very great lengths to discourage people not to follow the Tzedukim, meaning apparently this was a heresy that took root and was widely followed, and it had to be fought. By the way, the Karaites today follow the Tzedukim. Let me just have a little digression. I think I talked about this before, but just to talk about it very, very briefly at this point. People often confuse the Tzedukim and the Karaim, and even though there's a lot of overlap in their religious philosophies, these are two different movements. The Tzedukim were a movement that lived during the Second Temple, during the Bayis Sheni, and the founder of the movement was called Tzadok. There was another movement, Baisusim, founded by Baisos, but Tzedukim and Baisusim are kind of lumped together, and their common denominator was they did not accept the authority of the Torah Shebaal Peh. But what's interesting is that in many, many ways, the Tzedukim were more of a political movement than a religious movement, meaning many of the wealthy aristocracy were in fact Tzedukim, and it was connected with Hellenism as well, with not accepting the authority of the Chachamim. And as a result, it wasn't that they were such great tzaddikim that they wanted to interpret the Torah literally, but rather it was more convenient for them to have a more literal interpretation where they wouldn't have to follow rabbinic decrees and everything else. So this was the movement called Tzedukim, and the other side of it are the Prushim, which literally means those who separate from anything evil. The English or the Greek is called Pharisees. In the Christian Bible, the Pharisees are the bad guys, but in our tradition, the Pharisees are our Chachamim. Our sages are the Pharisees. Tzedukim and Prushim. Now, both movements actually expired upon the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, meaning the Tzedukim, Prushim, they stopped existing, but with one very important difference. The Tzedukim were simply no longer in existence. There was no movement of Tzedukim. Maybe there were individual people, you always had Apikorsim, but there was no movement Tzedukim. Prushim re-emerged as Chazal, meaning the word Prushim is not a term that we use for the later Tanoim or Amoraim. We call them Chazal. Chazal is Chachamenu Zichronim Livracha. So Prushim was only used as in a specific time frame when you contrast it to Tzedukim. Once there are no Tzedukim, there's no movement or group of people called Perushim, although they are our Chachamim, the Tanoim, the Amoraim, etc. Okay, so Tzedukim are gone. Now, Karaim is something that emerged after the Gemara. Karaim emerged in the 10th century, and we actually know the founder of Karaim is Anan ben David, and Anan ben David wanted a certain position as Reish Galusa, head of the exile. That was a political position where you were the political leader of the Jewish community. He did not get it for various reasons. So in a kind of a grudge match, he decided to found another religion which didn't accept any of that authority, and that was called Kara'im. Kara'im means psukim, that we're just going to focus on the biblical text. We're not going to pay attention to rabbinic authority and everything else. So Kara'im, you might say, are the spiritual successors of the Stukim, but there is no actual connection between Stukim and Kara'im. In fact, they're separated by actually by more than a thousand years. Now, again, the beliefs are more or less the same. And there are Karaites. Now, Karaites existed in very large numbers for a number of centuries. There were huge Karaite communities in Egypt, other places. Today, there is a Karaite community as well. There's even a chief rabbi of the Karaites. They are relatively small. In the United States, if there are Karaim, they don't have their own synagogues by and large. They kind of just walk into an Orthodox synagogue. It's kind of like an Orthodox person davening in a Reform temple because there's no other place to go. You're not supposed to do that, but no other place to go. So a Karai will go into an Orthodox synagogue, even though they view the Orthodox synagogue the way we might view a Reform temple or whatever it is. Over the years, the poskim have discussed, are Karaites even Jewish? Because of intermarriage and the like, but by and large, Karaim are considered to be Jews. They are Jews, but they don't believe in Torah Shebaal Peh. So even though they're, the same way as Reform Jews. In other words, they don't come at it the way Reform comes after it. Reform comes after it by denying divine revelation. Karaim believe in divine revelation, but they don't believe in the oral law. So it's a different type of process. And as I say, don't confuse the Kara'im and the Tzdukim, although their belief systems are very, very much the same. It's interesting, I remember in the Harvard University libraries, which has huge amounts of Svarim, and it always distresses me a little bit when universities have so many Svarim, it's like, the Gemara says everything depends on divine mazel, even where Sefer Torah winds up. So you think, one Gemara gets in a yeshiva where it's learned all the time with Hasmada Rabbah. Another Gemara lies on a university shelf where it may get picked up once every 1,000 years or whatever it is. Like it's really, I feel sad for the Sfarim. But in the Harvard University library, I noticed when I was once wandering through the Sfarim that they had a huge section of Karaite literature. So I was curious because I thought, how could the Karaites have a literature? They don't believe in oral interpretation. They don't believe in halachic development. They just have a biblical text. So what could they have beyond Tanakh itself? That's all they believe in. So you would actually be surprised that you can't really live without interpretation, meaning we have an interpretation going from Sinai. They don't believe in that. But they can't not interpret, so they have interpretations too. They have, it's not the same format, but they have their Gemara. They have their interpretations. So it's a funny thing. You try to make the claim, I don't go with any interpretations. No, they have interpretations. They have a siddur. So what's in their siddur? Their siddur has the Shema. Their siddur, but not the brachos before and after the Shema. Their siddur has the Tehillim of Psukei de Zimra, but not Baruch She'amar or Yishtabach. They don't have Birchas HaTorah. They don't have Birchas HaShachar because all of that is rabbinic activity. They don't have Shemona Esrei. But they have their own prayer. Somebody, I don't know who, somebody wrote a prayer that they say. It's a long prayer. So, why do they think their prayer is better than that prayer? I don't know. But they say, we don't accept that prayer. That's rabbinic authority. We're going to write our own. So they have Svarim too. I don't know Svarim, but they have books. Now, the other thing that's interesting is, though, that because Karaim were so focused on Tanakh, and they didn't look at Midrashim, they didn't look at Gemaras, they didn't look at what Rashi and other Mefarshim say, they actually became very, very proficient in grammar, in diktuk. That was their thing. Ad kedei kach, that occasionally we have our own Mefarshim who will quote Karaite commentaries on Nach to explain difficult words. This is sometimes done by the Ibn Ezra, although he often argues with the Karaite interpretations. It's done by the Abarbanel, because after all, the Karaites developed an expertise in biblical diktuk. You know, if you didn't have to learn Gemara, you could spend all your time on diktuk and things like that, and you might become a great expert at it. And even though the Karaites were technically kofrim apikorsim, but this falls under the rule that the Rambam says, Kabelas ha'emes mimisha amro, accept the truth from whatever source, and Karaites were used as a source in biblical interpretation. Not only that, there's a remarkable story. I suspect it may not be true, because it's too remarkable a story, about Rav Hai Gaon. Rav Hai Gaon was the last and the greatest of the Gaonim in Bavel. The Shiradik, Rav Hai Gaon. Just to give you a sense of how great he was, people said on the Vilna Gaon that we're more familiar with, he was a Gilgal of Rav Hai Gaon. That's how great Rav Hai Gaon was regarded. In fact, they even make a Gzera Shava, that when you say the Gaon, among Achrayim, you're referring to the Vilna Gaon. And when you say the Gaon, referring to the Gaonim, you're referring to Rav Hai Gaon. They're both called the Gaon. So the story goes that Rav Hai Gaon's yeshiva was right across the street from a monastery. And at some point, Rav Hai Gaon was learning Nach with his Talmidim, and they came to a difficult term. So Rav Hai Gaon said to one of his Talmidim, why don't you go across the street and ask them how they interpreted this word? Which means go to the monastery and ask a monk how they interpreted these words. So the Talmud didn't understand. He just was paralyzed and didn't know what to do. So Rav Hai Gaon said, what's the matter? You think you can't ask a Christian how they understand a particular verse? A lot of times it's going to be wrong, but sometimes it might be right. Kabel eso emes, mimi shomer. Go and see. And indeed, the Abarbanel later sometimes does bring Christian interpretation. Now, obviously, the Christian interpretations that bring in Jesus, that of course is, totally false. But in terms of words, in terms of meanings of words, remember the early Christians all knew Hebrew. Of course, Hebrew was the spoken language for many of them, just like Aramaic. This is fascinating. Aramaic. How many Jews speak Aramaic as an actual language? We learn Gemara. No Jews. Some say there's a Kurdish population that does, but by and large, Aramaic is not a Jewish language. It's a literary language. It's the language of rabbinic literature. But most of us, I include myself, we could not have a conversation in Aramaic. You'd have to know it pretty well. But there are Christian villages in Syria in which Aramaic, Talmudic Aramaic, is their spoken language. So that would actually mean if you're learning a Gemara and you don't have your art scroll, you don't have your jastro, but you happen to be in a Christian village in Syria, not so likely, you have somebody to ask. You can ask the non-Jewish person what this person, now of course language changes. I'm not saying they would automatically know everything, but the spoken Aramaic today is not exactly the same as the Aramaic of the Gemara, but it's pretty close. There are native Aramaic speakers who are not Jewish, because Aramaic was not only a Jewish language. Aramaic was a language, a Middle Eastern language. Hebrew is related to Aramaic, obviously. So, as a result, Karaim were utilized as sources in biblical interpretation, and I can refer to you to one particular book written by Karaites that is actually used as a sefer even today in anti-missionary work. There was a sefer written by a Karaite, I think in the 1600s. It was called Chizuk Emunah, Strengthening Faith. And what this does is, this goes through all of the psukim in Tanakh that missionaries use to prove Christianity. And the Karaite shows that a proper understanding of the verses would show you that it's not connected. Now, a book by a Karaite is a very powerful book for the following reason. If, let's say, a rabbi were to write the book, and the rabbi would say, oh no, your interpretation is wrong because it's contradicted by Rashi, or contradicted by the Gemara, or contradicted by the Medrash, that's not really a refutation, because the Christian will simply say, well, I don't accept Rashi, I don't accept Talmud, I don't accept Medrash. I look at the text. So all of the ways we try to refute missionaries by saying, no, you're contradicting Tosfos, you're contradicting the Rambam. It's like, so what? But the Karaite doesn't do that, you see. The Karaite doesn't bring in Tosfos or the Rambam or Rashi or Medrash or Gemara. The Karaite makes his case directly from the grammar and syntax of the words themselves. Now that a Christian is going to be stuck with, because a Christian is bound by the text. So it's interesting that a Karaite refutation of Christianity can actually be a very powerful refutation that the other side has to concede, as opposed to a refutation that's based on bringing Jewish sources. Because the most I can say is, your interpretation is not accepted by traditional Jewish sources. Okay, that's a position, but they can say, well, who says traditional Jewish sources are right? But the Karaite position, B'dafka, does not rely on traditional Jewish sources. And therefore, it actually is very strong. So the Sefer Chizuk Emunah is actually used even today by rabbis who are involved in anti-missionary work to be able to understand the psukim in a literal way, to be able to refute missionary claims. Yeah.
How did the Karaites handle putting on tefillin and sukkahs?
Yeah, so this is very, very fascinating. Karaites have websites, they've modernized their thing. And they do celebrate Shavuos, the holiday of Pentecost, whatever it is, starting on, counting the Omer on Sunday. So Shavuos will always be on Sunday, right, based on that 50th day. So the Karaites wear tzitzis. They will wear a talis, just like we wear a talis, because the Torah says fringes on the four corners of your garments. But tefillin, this is so interesting. People often say, Karaites are literalists. Well, tefillin is a very good example where they adopt a symbolic interpretation. They say that when the Torah says you shall bind them on your arm and between your eyes, they interpret it to mean you take God's law and you carry it out with your physical strength, and you take God's law and you bring it into your mind. Now, in truth, we actually interpret that as well, because that is the meaning of tefillin. But we concretize it in a physical ritual. They, b'dafka, make it metaphorical. So it's actually fascinating, because you would figure Karam would be the last people that would do metaphors. But yet, this is where they do metaphors. So Karam wear talis. They don't wear tefillin. Karaim do not blow shofar in Rosh Hashanah, because they interpret the words Yom Teruah. See, the Torah doesn't say blowing the shofar. It says a day of blowing, a day of Teruah. They interpret a day of shouting and praying to God, which is indeed a meaning of Teruah. So they do celebrate the holiday of Rosh Hashanah. They do not blow shofar. So it's interesting, minhagim, kind of an odd thing. It's not reform. I mean, halachically would be the same as reform, because it's kefira in Torah Shebaal Peh. But it's very different. In other words, a reform is trying to be modern. A Karaite is trying to be ancient. A Karaite, is very, very wedded to their ancient rituals, but those ancient rituals happen to be not the Masorah of Klal Yisrael. Yeah.
I've heard, and maybe I'm mistaken, the Karaites, I've heard that they will wear tefillin between their eyes. But I guess that's...
I'm not sure if that's true. That would fit the literal idea, for sure. And maybe I think by Stukim there was such a thing. I believe Karaites, I'm not an expert in this, and I don't want to encourage you to become an expert in it either, but I believe Karaites do not wear tefillin at all. Yeah.
Were Hellenist Jews more similar to Reform or to Tzdukim? Or?
Yeah, so Hellenist Jews were kind of Reform. Yeah, they were the Reform of the time, because essentially their agenda was modernization. Their agenda was assimilation. So they kind of made a religion that would allow them more to mix themselves. But Karam very much was not that way. Now again, Karam had its genesis in politics. Can't deny that. But eventually there were those who were, genuine, devout followers of the Karaite religion. They have Rosh Chodesh. They still calculate Rosh Chodesh by witnesses seeing the moon. They have, and then they circulate it by emails or whatever it is when Rosh Chodesh is. They don't accept the Jewish calendar per se. They do Kiddush HaChodesh by sighting of the moon. Yeah.
Korbanos? What do they do with that?
Yeah, they don't. Okay. So, well, they certainly do not bring korbanos. That's for sure, because they say you need a temple. That's correct. I mean, so their temple would be the Jerusalem temple. Again, there are a lot of different movements here. Don't confuse the Karaites with the Samaritans. The Samaritans are a totally different group, which are not even Jewish. They are descended from people who were brought into Israel at the time of the exile of the 10 tribes. So they've been here a long time, and they adopted some Jewish customs and some idolatrous customs, and they're a mishmash. Halachically, Samaritans are not Jews, but they still have sacrificial rites. They bring a korban Pesach, not in here. They bring it in Mount Gerizim, and it's a big ceremony. Many thousands of people go. Sometimes even Jews go. The truth is, a Jew shouldn't go because this is a sacrifice to idolatry. I mean, people say, "Oh, I want to learn what the korban Pesach looked like," because they kind of do it the same way. But what are you doing? I mean, you're going to a korban of avodah zorah and the like. So it wouldn't be proper. But still, there are Jews who go there. So Samaritans and Karaites are very, very different. Karaites are halachically Jewish. Samaritans are not halachically Jewish. Yeah.
So I remember the Rav once mentioned something in regards to Tinoch Shneshma, that the Chazon Ish said that really a lot of the people who use the Rambam might say not Tinoch Shneshma really are.
Yeah, so first of all, the Rambam himself has a reference to Karaites. I don't even have to bring in the Chazon Ish. The Rambam writes, and the Rambam, by the way, had to deal with Karaites all the time, because the Rambam was in Egypt, and Egypt had a huge Karaite population. Many Karaites, many synagogues, many different things, and the Rambam had to combat the Karaite heresies very, very often. So he writes that a Karaite is a kofar b'Torah shebal peh and does not have a chelik in olam haba. But then the Rambam says that only referred to the first generations who learned the Torah and rebelled against it, like Anan ben David. But the children of the Karaites are like, this is the Rambam himself, Tinoch Shenishpa, like a baby that was captured. They never knew the emes, they were never exposed to the emes. And the Rambam's language is, it is a mitzvah to be makarev them, to befriend them, and to try to bring them to the way of Torah. So it's not just the Chazon Ish, the Rambam himself. Now, we did discuss Bi'arichos. Does that mean they get a share in Olam Haba? Meaning it's not clear. The Rambam seems to say Olam Haba is out for them. That's the admission ticket. In other words, Tinoch Shenishba doesn't get you into Olam Haba. But in terms of Olam Hazeh, I should try to be makarev them and befriend them, so they will get a share in Olam Haba. So the Rambam did have, in terms of interpersonal behavior, a very tolerant attitude towards the later generations of Karaites, because he did regard them as, in fact, he's the first one that does this. The case of, the Gemara uses the Lashon Tinoch Shenishba, but in the Gemara it quite literally meant somebody was kidnapped and raised in Africa. The extension to modern heretical movements are Tinoch Shenishba. That was the Rambam's Chiddush. The Rambam is the one who utilized Tinoch Shenishba to describe people who were raised in heresy, even though there are Orthodox Jews around, or religious Jews around them. So today, when we say a modern secular Jew is a Tinoch Shenishba, we're really building on the Rambam in Hilchos Mamre.
That doesn't seem from.
So that was a big machlokas, meaning if you read the Rambam literally, it seems not to give them olam haba, but others say no, Tinoch Shenishba is not considered a sinner at all, and therefore he'll still get a chelik in olam haba. So that's a big machlokas. Rav Chaim Soloveitchik said, an apikaris is an apikaris, nebuch, even if he feels sorry for him, he's still an apikaris, what can I do? But some people question whether Rav Chaim's statement is totally accepted by everybody. Tiferes Yisrael, for example, seems to say that even a kaifer can get olam haba for the good that he's done in the world. He cured cancer or gave charity or whatever. Okay, so this was a huge digression, not connected to our topic, but again, it's good to just be aware of history a little bit. But now, let's go back to the Omer issue. And the Omer issue is the Stukim, and today the Karayim, they interpret Shabbos to mean Saturday, and Mimacharas Shabbos is Sunday. And you start counting the Omer on Sunday. The Prushim say no, that based on Torah Shebal Peh, Shabbos does not refer to Saturday, but Shabbos refers to the first day of Pesach. Mimachras Shabbos is the second day of Pesach. So the question is very obvious. Why does the Torah use the word Shabbos if it means Pesach? In other words, why does the Torah use a word that is so fraught with misunderstanding and misapplication? So the Ibn Ezra gives a partial answer, but it's not really an answer. The Ibn Ezra says, well, what should it say? So the answer is pashut. Instead of saying Mimacharas HaShabbos, say Mimacharas HaPesach, the day after Pesach, meaning the first day of Yom Tov. So the Ibn Ezra says, no. Mimacharas HaPesach would have given you the wrong time. Because here is the thing you need to know. Pesach, Chag HaPesach, in the Torah, does not refer to the 15th of Nisan. It refers to the 14th of Nisan, which is Erev Pesach, when you bring the Korban Pesach. See, the Torah has two terms for the holiday. It is called Chag HaMatzos, the holiday of Matzah, and it is called Pesach. But they don't start the same time. Chag HaMatzos starts the night of the 15th of Nisan. Chag HaPesach starts on the 14th of Nisan, which is the day that you bring the Korban. You don't eat it till night, but the day that you bring the Korban Pesach is the 14th. So the Ibn Ezra says, if the Torah would have said, you start counting the Omer the day after Pesach, you would have said Pesach is the 14th, the day after Pesach is the 15th, so you would start counting the Omer the 15th of Nisan. Therefore, the Ibn Ezra says, the Torah had to say the day after Shabbos, meaning the day after a day that you weren't allowed to do malacha. The day after a day of rest. So that tells me it's the day after the 15th, which is a day of rest, because on Erev Pesach, although it's true that midrabanan, there are various restrictions on malacha on Erev Pesach, but that's old Rabbanan. D'oraisa, Erev Pesach is not a day of shavisa. Erev Pesach is not a day of rest, and therefore it wouldn't be called Shabbos. So the Ibn Ezra's answer is, it had to say Mimacharas HaShabbos, because that gets you to the 16th, because if it would have said Mimacharas HaPesach, it would have gotten you to the 15th. Yeah, just let me finish the sentence. Now, that is not really an answer for the following reason. It's true that Mimacharas HaPesach might get you the wrong date, but Mimacharas HaShabbos can also get you the wrong date, because you can interpret Shabbos to mean Shabbos, like the Tzdukim. In other words, you're avoiding one ambiguity by using a term that gives you another ambiguity. So what are you gaining there, right? So if you ask me, well, so what can the Torah do? Got to write something. Oh, I'll give you something very simple. Give the date. Say, don't use Mimacharas HaShabbos. Say, Usvartem lachem, you shall count, biyom shisha asar lachodesh harishon, on the 16th day of the first month, Sheva Shabbos Etzris. There's no ambiguity. 16th day of Nisan, second day of Pesach. Don't use Shabbos. Don't say Mimacharas HaShabbos. Don't say Mimacharas HaPesach. Don't use the Mimacharas language at all. Just say Shisha Asar. Did you want to say something?
Yeah. The question: why couldn't the Torah get out of both problems and say 2 days after Pesach?
Okay. So again, I just said it could have.
But that
yeah.
way it keeps the idea of like, oh, it's post Pesach,
Svartim lachem shnei. Well, okay. The thing is, that would be an extremely unique formulation. I don't think there's any place in the Torah where a time for a ritual is given 2 days after something. In other words, the Torah sometimes says, the day you do something, do this, or the day after you do something, do this. The idea is 2 days after you do something, do this. It would literally be, it's just not a lashon that the Torah uses. But okay. All right, so we're back to square one, basically. That is, why does the Torah refer to the first day of Pesach by the appellation Shabbos? It's so prone to misunderstanding. So I'll begin. I probably won't finish it today. So the Meshech Chochmah has a very, very beautiful, intricate explanation, which starts off with important Yesodos generally. When we look at the difference in Shabbos and Yom Tov, right? There's the holiness of Shabbos, and there's the holiness of Yom Tov. What are the differences between the holiness of Shabbos and Yom Tov? So there are two major differences. Difference number one is that Yom Tov has a heter that is called ochel nefesh. See, again, both Shabbos and Yom Tov start off, you're not allowed to do 39 malachos. Right? That's where you start off. Shabbos, I cannot do malacha. Yom Tov, I cannot do malacha. The same. The punishment is not the same, but the prohibition is the same. But then, Yom Tov has a huge category of exception, that Shabbos does not have. And this category of exception is called ochel nefesh, which literally means anything to do with food preparation. So you are allowed to cook. You are allowed to, again, even there, very early stages are prohibited. In fact, the general rule is everything from kneading onwards. So you can make a dough, and you can bake, etc. You're actually not allowed to harvest and do things earlier than kneading. But there's a hedger you can carry. There's a hedger of ochel nefesh. Now, ochel nefesh is broader than just food preparation. It actually applies to anything which enhances your enjoyment of Yom Tov. So I can carry my keys without an Erev, even though I'm not using keys for food, but I have to carry because that's part of a Yom Tov. So Yom Tov has a heter called ochel nefesh. You can warm water. Now, halachically, you're not allowed to take a whole bath or a whole shower because that's, at least in the time of Chazal, that was not something that most people needed to do on a regular basis. But you could warm water to wash your face, wash your hands, because washing is also called a pleasure. That's nichlal in the heter of ochel nefesh. So Yom Tov has a heter called ochel nefesh, food preparation. Shabbos does not have a heter of food preparation, right? That is difference number one. Difference number two is what generates the holiness of Shabbos and what generates the holiness of Yom Tov. Shabbos, the holiness is independent of anything I do. Every seventh day is Shabbos. Whether I know it, whether I don't know it, whether I observe it, whether I don't observe it. God sanctified the Shabbos. So even if there would not be a single Jew that would keep Shabbos, God forbid, the spiritual holiness of Shabbos is a reality. And even though I do something called I make Kiddush, but I make Kiddush does not mean I sanctify Shabbos, but I acknowledge that Hashem made Shabbos a holy day. Indeed, how does Kiddush end? Baruch atah Hashem. Blessed art you, Hashem. Mikadesh HaShabbos. You have sanctified Shabbos. I don't make Shabbos holy. Hashem made Shabbos holy. Yom Tov is a totally different picture. Yom Tov is holy only by virtue of the Sanhedrin of 71 that sanctified a new moon by the testimony of witnesses. I'll talk about how it works today. And that day becomes Rosh Chodesh, and all the holidays are X number of days from that Rosh Chodesh. Rosh Hashanah happens to be the day of that Rosh Chodesh. Sukkos will be 15 days from that Rosh Chodesh. Pesach will be 15 days from Rosh Chodesh Nisan. In other words, the holiness of the Yom Tov only comes because of the action of the Sanhedrin in sanctifying the new moon. And that is why, even if they got the wrong day, even if they made a mistake, the holidays are not from the astronomical. Rosh Chodesh on one level is an astronomical reality, right? The moon goes around the earth. The rotation is approximately 29 to 30 days in the middle. And when the moon is visible, that is technically Rosh Chodesh. But the holidays are not measured from the technical Rosh Chodesh. The holidays are measured. Again, I'll talk about how it works today. But in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, certainly, the holidays are measured not from the astronomical Rosh Chodesh. The holidays are measured from the day that the Sanhedrin sanctified as Rosh Chodesh, which might be the astronomical Rosh Chodesh, yeah, but it might not be, because the witnesses lied or the Sanhedrin made a mistake. Remember, this is the famous story where Rabbi Yehoshua maintained, it's a Mishnah. Rabbi Yehoshua maintained that the Sanhedrin made a mistake in sanctifying a certain day as Rosh Hashanah, and it should be the next day. And therefore, according to him, Yom Kippur would be a day later. Sukkot should be a day later. Everything would be Rosh Hashanah would be a day later. Rabban Gamliel, the head of the Sanhedrin, ordered Rabbi Yehoshua to come to him with his money and his staff on his day, that was Yom Kippur, the day after the Sanhedrin's Yom Kippur. And Rabbi Yehoshua didn't know what to do, and Rabbi Akiva told him, listen, even if they're wrong, they're right. Astronomically, your day is Yom Kippur. But halachically, spiritually, the Yom Kippur is based on the Kiddush HaChodesh of the Sanhedrin, who are representing the Jewish people. So Shabbos is a holiness that does not depend on us. Yom Tov is a holiness that we create via the Sanhedrin. Again, I'll talk later about how does that work today if you don't have a Sanhedrin. That is why on Shabbos, the bracha is Baruch Atah Hashem Mikadesh HaShabbos. God sanctifies Shabbos. On Yom Tov, the bracha is Baruch Atah Hashem Mikadesh Yisrael V'Hazmanim. You sanctify Israel. And by sanctifying Am Yisrael, the Zmanim, the holidays, get sanctified through them. Very meduyak. You don't say on Shabbos, Mekadesh Yisrael v'HaShabbos. And you don't say on Yom Tov, Mekadesh Hazmanim. Mekadesh Yisrael v'Hazmanim. That's why it's meduyak. When Yom Tov and Shabbos coincide, so how do you have to say it? Baruch Atah Hashem, Mekadesh HaShabbos v'Yisrael v'Hazmanim. See how meduyak the nusach of tefillah is. You don't say Mekadesh Yisrael v'HaShabbos v'Hazmanim. Rather, Mekadesh HaShabbos. Hashem is Mekadesh HaShabbos. V'Yisrael. He sanctifies Yisrael v'Hazmanim, who therefore have the power to sanctify time. So these are two important distinctions between Yom Tov and Shabbos. One is Yom Tov has Ochel Nefesh, and Shabbos does not have Ochel Nefesh. Number two, Yom Tov, the holiness comes from us via the Sanhedrin, comes from Klal Yisrael, as opposed to Shabbos, the holiness comes from Hashem. Now, just as a little aside, again, connecting it to the Omer we'll get to next time, but the little aside is, if indeed Yom Tov does not depend on astronomy, it depends on a Kiddush HaChodesh, a sanctification of the new moon by the Sanhedrin. Now that we don't have the Sanhedrin, even though we know astronomically when Rosh Chodesh is, why are there Yomim Tovim? There's no Sanhedrin that's sanctifying the new moon. So, again, it's a machlokes, but the Ramban at least explains that the last Sanhedrin, the Romans abolished the Sanhedrin in around the 5th century, I think the 400s. And one of the very last Nesiim of the Sanhedrin before it was abolished was a person, he was a great, I don't know how many generations, descendant of Hillel. His name was Hillel as well. But he's way after, again, this is around the time of the Talmud Yerushalmi. This is way after the Mishnah already. And so remember, the Sanhedrin was functioning, okay, this is also worthy to keep in mind. The Sanhedrin was functioning for centuries after the destruction of the temple. Meaning the Kiddush HaChodesh did not stop with the abolition of with the destruction of the temple. It continued until the Romans did not allow a Sanhedrin to function. So what Hillel HaSheni did was, he's called Hillel HaSheni, was he, with all the Chachamim, created the Jewish calendar, extrapolating all the Roshei Chadashim indefinitely, some say to the year 6000, because Mashiach will come before then. And what they did was they sanctified all of those Roshei Chadashim in advance. In other words, imagine that you had a computer printout, of course it wasn't a computer printout, of I don't know how many Rosh Chodeshes you could, like 1,000 years, 12 Rosh Chodeshes. So you have 12,000 dates that you got to sanctify as Rosh Chodesh. Right? So they sat for a few hours, and they said, okay, this certain date is going to be Rosh Chodesh Tishrei for that, etc. And they kept on going and going and going. So the Ramban says the only reason we have Yom Tovim is not because of astronomy. We have Yom Tovim because the last Sanhedrin was Makadesh all the Yom Tovim in advance. And that is the meaning of the oft-repeated statement that the Jewish calendar will expire in the year 6000. Now, what does it mean, the Jewish calendar will expire in the year 6000? It certainly does not mean the calculations are inoperative. We have a structure. We have a calendrical, computational structure. We could predict when Pesach is going to be in the next 1,000,000 years. I mean, we have the mathematics to be able to project. But Hillel sanctified the new moons only until the year 6000 in the belief that Mashiach will be here by then and we'll go back to the old system with the Sanhedrin. So quite literally what that means is, if counterfactually, Mashiach would not come by the year 6000, there would no longer be the observance of Yom Tovim. You won't have to keep Rosh Hashanah, Sukkot, Pesach, Shavuos, Shabbos, you'll still have to keep. See the word, that's what it means. The calendar expires because the Yom Tov cycle depends on a Kiddush Beis Din. Without a Kiddush Beis Din, there's no Kedushas Yom Tov, amazingly. And even today, it's only because of a Kiddush Beis Din. Right? So these are two differences between Shabbos and Yom Tov. Next time we'll see how this is going to apply to the counting of the Yomer.